The road into Henryetta is one of those stretches of Oklahoma highway that can lull you into thinking nothing truly terrible could ever happen here. It's open sky, wind in the grass, rusted fences, and mobile homes tucked back behind clusters of trees. On the morning of May 1, 2023, that illusion shattered. 7 people were dead on a rural property just outside this small town. 6 of them were kids and a mom. The 7th was the man who killed them, a convicted sex offender named Jesse McFadden. By the time deputies and state investigators finished combing through the land, what they were looking at would be described as a murder-suicide, a massacre, and a catastrophic failure of the criminal justice system all at once. Parents had sent their daughters to what was supposed to be a normal teenage sleepover. Instead, they were picking out coffins. And at the center of it all was a man who should have been behind bars that very day, walking into a courtroom to finally face a jury on fresh child exploitation charges he'd racked up while serving time for rape. The last weekend of April 2023 started like hundreds of other weekends in Henryetta, a town of about 6,000 people roughly 90 miles east of Oklahoma City. 13-year-old Tiffany Guess had big plans. She was having friends over to her mom's place outside town, a property with a small house, a shed or two, and rough open land stretching out behind it. It wasn't fancy, but for teenagers it had the one thing that matters most on a sleepover weekend: a little distance from adults, a little bit of freedom and space to talk, joke, and stay up way too late. Tiffany's mom, 35-year-old Rylee Guess, worked from home selling life insurance. Her own mother, Janet, would later describe Rylee as the kind of mom who poured herself into her kids, overprotective, always there, the person who signed up, showed up, and cheered loudest. Rylee had 3 children, 17-year-old Rylee, 15-year-old Michael, and Tiffany. This was a blended family trying to build something stable in a quiet corner of Oklahoma, even if the foundations were already cracked in ways Rylee's relatives didn't fully see until it was too late. Joining Tiffany for the sleepover were 2 friends who felt more like extended family, 14-year-old Webster and 15-year-old Brittany Brewer. Ivy came from a tight-knit home where her parents kept close tabs on her social circle, but like most parents of teenagers, were always trying to balance safety with letting her grow up. Brittany was outgoing, bubbly, and had just been selected to be Miss Henryetta for an upcoming national Miss pageant in Tulsa that July. Her dad would later stand at a vigil and tell the crowd that she'd wanted to be a teacher or a veterinarian. She was the kind of kid who made plans, who thought about the future as if it were a given. The girls had stayed at Rylee's before. As far as Ivy's and Brittany's families knew, they were going to hang out, maybe ride 4-wheelers, watch movies, talk about pageants and boys and school, and come home tired but happy. If there were any worries, they were the ordinary ones: too much soda, not enough sleep, maybe someone twisting an ankle on the property. The deeper danger, the criminal history of the man living in that house, and the reality of what he'd already done to other girls, was still hidden or dismissed or buried under lies. The man's name was Jesse McFadden. He was 39 years old, a registered sex offender with a 20-year sentence for rape on his record, and a new round of charges for soliciting sexual conduct with a minor and possessing child sexual abuse material that he'd allegedly committed while already incarcerated. On the very day those 7 bodies would be discovered on his rural property, he was supposed to be walking into a courtroom in Muskogee County, where a jury was finally set to hear about the way he'd used a contraband phone from a prison cell to target another teenage girl. He never made it to court. To understand how that could happen, how a man with Jesse's record ended up in a home full of children, free, armed, and facing a trial he clearly intended never to attend, you have to go back 20 years, to a different Oklahoma town and another teenager whose life he shattered. Jesse dropped out of high school in 9th grade, for reasons that are not well documented in public records, and by late 2002, he was already on a path that would bring him into violent contact with the law. He was living in or around McAlester, Oklahoma, and in 2003 he was convicted of rape in a case involving a 16-year-old girl. The victim in that case has since publicly identified herself and described how he held a knife to her throat, tied her to bedposts, and attacked her when she was still a minor. This wasn't a situation that could be brushed off as a misunderstanding or a close-in-age relationship gone slightly outside the law. It was violent, intentional, and terrifying. For that attack, Jesse was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was sent to Joseph Harp Correctional Center in Lexington, a facility that houses some of Oklahoma's most serious offenders, including people convicted of sex crimes. You might think that a 20-year sentence for a crime that severe would mean 2 decades of close supervision, deep treatment, and constant risk assessment. What happened instead is that the same patterns that brought Jesse into prison followed him inside, and crucially, didn't stop him from eventually walking back out. Inside Joseph Harp, he shared a cell at one point with a man named James Fleming, who would later speak publicly about what it was like to live in close quarters with him. Fleming said Jesse was a very sexual person, whose conversations always pushed towards something explicit, to the point where Fleming felt uncomfortable and on guard even in his sleep. He recalled being woken up by Jesse's muttering at night, phrases that sounded like he was acting out assaults in his dreams, crude commands hurled at imaginary victims. Fleming told reporters that if he hadn't been as mentally and physically strong as he was, he believed Jesse might have tried to target him too. At first, Fleming didn't know Jesse was in for rape. Once he found out, he said the sentence length alone told him that this wasn't any kind of borderline case. You don't get 20 years in Oklahoma because someone's parents got mad about a teenage relationship. Jesse, for his part, reportedly tried to justify what he'd done, minimizing it the way offenders often do, as if words could shrink the harm he'd caused. Even inside prison, the pattern was there: rationalization, obsession, entitlement, and an almost complete lack of empathy for the girl whose life he had already twisted. Still, in a system more focused on ticking boxes than deeply understanding risk, time kept passing. He worked prison jobs, did his days, and somewhere along the way he managed to get his hands on something he was absolutely not supposed to have: a cell phone. That phone became his tunnel back into the world he should never have been allowed to enter again: the world of teenage girls, grooming, and exploitation. Around 2015-2017, still behind bars on his original rape conviction, Jesse used that contraband phone to contact a 16-year-old girl. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near kids, physically or digitally, but that didn't matter when a smartphone and a signal could turn a prison cell into a hunting ground. According to court documents and reports, he convinced the girl to send explicit images and videos, and he sent her photos of himself in return, including at least one in which he was fully exposed. He pressured, manipulated, and controlled, the same way he had done with his first victim, only now the tools were different: messages instead of threats in a bedroom, a screen instead of a knife. Eventually, authorities discovered what he was doing. The phone was confiscated. In 2017, prosecutors charged him with new felonies: soliciting sexual conduct or communication with a minor, and possessing child sexual abuse material. On paper, that should have instantly transformed him from a man doing time on an old case into an inmate facing a fresh set of serious offenses that could keep him locked up for decades more. But the system did something else. Those new charges did not automatically reset his release date. Instead, Oklahoma let the original sentence keep running while the new case crawled through the courts. There were delays, some related to COVID, some to legal wrangling, some to the grinding slowness that victims in many jurisdictions know all too well. All the while, Jesse remained technically eligible for release on the 2003 case, even though the new allegations showed that he was still targeting minors from inside a supposedly secure environment. The victim in the 2017 case later described how he kept calling her even after the phone was taken, pushing her to recant, to show up at courthouses and try to get the case dropped. At one point, She drove roughly 2 hours to a courthouse at his urging. Hopping her presence would make prosecutors back off. That's how deep his control ran. Over time, though, she started to understand what had been done to her, and she decided not to back down. She was prepared to testify against him when his trial date finally arrived in 2023. She wasn't the only one trying to keep him from getting out. The victim in the original Grape case called and left messages with officials, telling them she'd seen that he still had contraband child material and asking how that didn't prove he wasn't rehabilitated. She said she was given the runaround, transferred and stalled, while paperwork kept moving forward that would let him out early anyway. In October 2020, Jesse McFadden walked out of prison. He had served roughly 17 years of his 20-year sentence, having completed the mandatory 85% required under Oklahoma law for violent offenders. Within a month, he was arrested again on the 2017 charges and then released on a $25,000 bond. He was back in the community, a registered sex offender on paper, but living a life that on the surface looked almost ordinary. A job in marketing, a relationship, a home. Underneath, the same entitlement and rage were still there. Sometime after his release, Jesse met Rylee Guess. By the time her mother, Jeanette, truly understood who he was, Rylee and Jesse were already deeply entangled. Public records and family accounts show that they eventually married, by some reports, through a jail-related chaplain service, formally tying her and her 3 kids to a man whose entire adult life had been marked by violence and exploitation. From the outside, Holly's relatives saw what looked like a whirlwind relationship that quickly became serious. Jeanette described her daughter as someone who loved fiercely, who wanted stability for her kids, and who may have been vulnerable to the kinds of stories Jesse knew how to tell, stories that minimized his crimes, recast him as the victim of misunderstandings, or claimed he'd been young and unfairly punished. The 2003 victim has said that Jesse actually paid a woman to impersonate her and tell Rylee that the Grape case was all made up and that she'd been 19 at the time, not 16. In other words, he was willing to invest money, planning, and lies to rewrite the past just enough to keep his new partner from running. Jeanette would later say she only learned the full extent of his criminal history very close to the end. Ivy's and Brittany's parents said they did not know he was a convicted sex offender at all when they allowed their daughters to go to that house. Jesse was on the state's sex offender registry, but in practice, that didn't translate into clear, accessible warnings for the people whose lives intersected with his. Oklahoma law bars many offenders from living near schools or child care facilities, but it did not stop a man with a Grape conviction from living in a home with children who were not his victims. The relationship between Jesse and Rylee grew more controlling over time, according to family members. Relatives later told reporters that Jesse kept a tight hold on Rylee's phone and social contacts. He had the classic profile of an abuser who mixes affection and control, leaning on his partner emotionally while also isolating her from people who might question him. On social media and in certain conversations, though, he could present himself as a man who'd made mistakes and moved on, a reformed offender building a great life. By January 2022, Rylee had legally purchased a 9mm handgun. That weapon, bought by a woman who likely believed it would help her protect her family, would eventually be used against that family and 2 of their children's friends. Meanwhile, Jesse's 2017 case crept forward in the courts. COVID-19 led to delays and backlogs, and hearings were pushed. Still, the charges did not go away, and the 2017 victim, now in her 20s, remained determined to testify. In late April 2023, the trial date was finally set, May 1, 2023. For the first time, a jury was poised to hear detailed evidence about how, even in prison, Jesse had allegedly targeted a 16-year-old girl for exploitation. A conviction could have sent him back to prison for decades, with the charges carrying potential sentences of 10 and 20 years respectively. On the evening of April 30, the night before that trial, the victim received a Facebook message from an account using the name Holly Days. The profile photo was Jesse's face. He wrote that he had a great life now, a job in marketing, and that he'd done what he'd promised, gotten out, built something. Now it's all gone, he told her. I told you I wouldn't go back. In another message he said, "This is all on you for continuing this." The victim later said she read that as him blaming her not only for the potential loss of his freedom, but for what he was about to do. At first, she wasn't sure what he meant. She thought he'd maybe lost his job and was angry, but she knew he wasn't supposed to be contacting her at all while out on bond. She took screenshots and sent them to the prosecutor, who was preparing to try the case in court the very next morning. Whatever Jesse was planning, he had made one point painfully clear in those final messages. He had no intention of walking back into a prison cell. On the weekend of April 29-30, while those messages were being typed from that rural property, Tiffany was getting ready for her sleepover. She'd invited Ivy and Brittany, two friends who had been part of the family's orbit for a while. Their parents say they had no idea that a registered sex offender lived in the home. What they knew was that their daughters were excited, that there would be other kids around, that this was supposed to be a safe, supervised get-together. Ivy's parents dropped her off and expected text updates and a normal pickup the next day. Brittany's father, Nathan, later described how she was thrilled not just about the sleepover, but about life in general. She'd just been chosen to represent Henrietta in that upcoming pageant. He used words like outgoing and full of life, the kind of descriptions that sting because they underline what's been stolen. Inside the house and out on the property, based on what investigators believe, the teens did the kinds of things teens do: talked, joked, explored the land a little, took in the feeling of being out of town and away from school. Holly moved between being host, mom, and partner. Jesse moved in his own orbit, this man in his late 30s, living with 3 stepchildren, 2 visiting teens, and a wife who, by multiple accounts, did not fully understand the danger he represented. At some point during that weekend, the situation tipped from ordinary to lethal. The exact timeline of the killings is not known in minute-by-minute detail, but investigators and autopsy reports have provided a general picture. What we do know is that all 6 victims, Holly, her 3 children, and the 2 visiting girls, were shot in the head. According to the medical examiner's office, Holly, Michael, and Tiffany sustained multiple gunshot wounds to the head, while Rylee, Ivy, and Brittany each died from gunshot wounds to the head. The autopsies also concluded that Ivy and Brittany had injuries consistent with sexual assault before their deaths. The weapon used was the 9mm handgun that Holly had legally purchased in January 2022. Investigators later said that Jesse appeared to have staged the scene before killing himself, though specific details about what that staging entailed have not been fully disclosed. On the property, authorities discovered the bodies in various locations. According to Ocmulgee County Sheriff Eddie Rice, 3 bodies were found in one area, while the other 4 were discovered together approximately 450 yards away. This wasn't a chaotic burst of random violence. The evidence suggests it was methodical, carried out at close range over a period of time. At some point, Jesse turned the gun on himself and died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. By then, 6 lives were already gone. What no one yet knew on the outside was that multiple systems had already failed these victims long before those shots were fired. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Ivy and Brittany didn't come home. Their parents started calling, texting, waiting for updates that never came. They couldn't reach Holly either. As the hours passed on May 1, 2023, panic set in. The Oklahoma Highway Patrol issued an Amber Alert for Ivy and Brittany, noting that they were believed to be with Jesse McFadden and describing him as a registered sex offender. For some families, that alert was the first time they saw his name paired with those words. At almost the same time in Muskogee County, court officials were noting that Jesse had failed to appear for his long-delayed trial. His absence wasn't just a technical problem. In the context of the Amber Alert, it became a flashing red warning. Authorities began searching the rural property near Henryetta where he lived with Holly and the kids. Ocmulgee County Sheriff Eddie Rice would later describe what deputies found there as a very tragic situation. 7 bodies were discovered on or near the property: Jesse's, Holly's, her 3 children, Rylee, Michael, and Tiffany, and the 2 visiting teens, Ivy and Brittany. Law enforcement clarified that all signs pointed to Jesse as the sole shooter, with no evidence that anyone else had participated in the killings. When word reached the families, disbelief crashed into grief. Jeanette, Holly's mother, said investigators told her that her daughter and grandchildren had all been shot in the head, her daughter multiple times. She stood before cameras and said, "Oklahoma failed to protect families, and because of that my children, my daughter, and my grandchildren are all gone. I'm never going to get to see them, never going to get to hold them, and it's killing me," she added. At a vigil, Brittany's father looked out at hundreds of people and said he was living a parent's worst nightmare. He talked about the pageant his daughter would never attend, the future careers she'd never get to choose between, the everyday moments that had been erased. Ivy's parents, too, spoke about how they had tried to keep her safe, how they had no idea that sending her to a friend's house meant sending her into the orbit of a man like Jesse. In their voices, you can hear not just sorrow but a kind of stunned fury at a system that had every warning it needed and still failed them. As more details emerged, the story somehow got even darker. Reporters visited the property after law enforcement had released the scene back to the owner. Inside what locals began to call the House of Horrors, journalists from Oklahoma station KFOR reportedly found items that should have been obvious evidence: hand restraints, sex toys, and drug paraphernalia, all apparently left behind after investigators declared that part of the case processed. Those items were later seized by authorities, but for the families, the discovery raised searing questions about how thorough the initial investigation had been. If physical evidence could be left sitting in plain sight, what else had been missed? Were there digital devices that hadn't been fully analyzed yet? Phones, laptops, storage drives that might contain messages, photos, or videos pointing to other victims or shedding light on Jesse's mindset? The fact that media crews were among the first to publicize those items left families feeling like the system had failed them all over again. The Ocmulgee County Sheriff's Office and Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation have maintained that the core facts are clear. Jesse McFadden shot 6 people and then killed himself. But clarity about the sequence of shots doesn't answer the deeper questions that haunt this case: why he was free, why he had access to these kids, and why so many warnings had gone unheeded. When people first heard that Jesse had been released early from a 20-year grape sentence despite picking up new child exploitation charges in prison, the natural reaction was, how is that even possible? Defense attorney Lee Berlin, who specializes in sex crimes, said publicly that even he couldn't understand it. "I'm a sex crimes defense attorney. This is all I do all day, every day, and I'm like, how the hell does that happen?" he said. The outrage from someone whose job is to defend people like Jesse underlines just how far out of line this case is with what many would expect as basic public safety logic. Here's what we know. Jesse was sentenced to 20 years in 2003 for grape. While serving that sentence, he was caught using a contraband phone to solicit and possess explicit material from a 16-year-old girl, conduct that led to new charges in 2017. Despite those new charges, the Department of Corrections still allowed his original sentence to run its course, and he was released in October 2020 after about 17 years, having served the mandatory 85% for violent offenders. He wasn't held pending trial on the new case. Instead, he was arrested, posted a $25,000 bond, and went home. From that point on, he was a free man with a sex offender registration obligation, a pending felony case, and no apparent daily supervision that prevented him from living with children or having visiting teens in his home. The trial was repeatedly delayed, in part by COVID disruptions, and by the time May 1, 2023 rolled around, He'd had more than 2 years of freedom he never should have had. Family members of the victims have said that if the system had taken the warning signs seriously, if contraband child material in prison had been treated as proof of ongoing danger, they believe their loved ones would still be alive. Jeanette has asked why someone who showed he could not follow rules even inside a locked facility was given the benefit of the doubt outside of it. The 2017 victim has said that she came forward and stuck with the case because she thought she was protecting other people from being hurt like she was, only to learn that the man she helped expose had been living openly with kids the entire time the court process dragged on. There are policy questions here that go far beyond one man. Why didn't the discovery of contraband sexual material involving a minor automatically trigger a review of Jesse's eligibility for early release? Why was a bond of $25,000 considered sufficient for someone with a violent rape conviction and fresh charges involving a teen? Why is it legally possible for a registered sex offender with that history to live in a home with children and host unsupervised teen sleepovers, as long as those kids weren't his documented past victims? After the killings, local residents launched petitions calling for harsher sentences and no early release for convicted sex offenders, as well as better public notification systems, including boards at police stations and schools listing local offenders with photos. The petitions argued that easy-to-access information could have helped families understand who Jesse was before they let their kids near him. Whether those specific proposals become law or not, they show a community grasping for tools to prevent another Henryetta. When we talk about a case like this, it's easy for the narrative to become fixated on the perpetrator, his history, his psychology, his decisions in that final, horrific weekend. But the center of this story should always be the people whose lives he took, because they're the ones who should still be here. Holly was described by her mother as a fantastic mother, who would go 100% for her children in anything they wanted to do. She'd moved around in her life, born in El Paso, Texas, later in Oklahoma. But what grounded her was her kids, their school events, their hobbies, their future. Jeanette's last memory of her daughter and grandchildren is of driving 2 hours to see Tiffany sing in a school choir concert, hugging them all, and then heading back home, not knowing that she would never see them alive again. Rylee was at that point in adolescence where you're both kid and adult, juggling family responsibilities and your own interests. 15-year-old Michael was figuring out who he wanted to be in the world, a boy in that restless, possibility-filled window before adulthood hardens into specific paths. 13-year-old Tiffany was a connector. It was her friendship with Ivy and Brittany that brought those girls into the house that weekend, because that's what teenagers do. They link different families together through shared songs, shared jokes, shared sleepovers. Ivy's parents have talked about her love of animals, her friendships, the way she lit up rooms in an ordinary, beautiful teenage way. Brittany's father keeps coming back to how outgoing she was, how excited she'd been about representing Henryetta in that pageant, how she wanted to be both a teacher and a veterinarian, because the world still seemed big enough to hold more than one dream. All of that, those trajectories, those inside jokes, those future graduations and weddings and birthday dinners, ended on a patch of land outside a small Oklahoma town because one man was allowed chance after chance he never earned, and because the people in charge of protecting the public failed to connect the dots in time. In the months after the killings, grief in Henryetta and beyond shifted into something else, a demand for accountability. Jeanette spoke again and again about how she believed the state had failed not just her family, but every parent who relied on the justice system to keep dangerous offenders contained. She and others have asked for investigations into how Jesse's early release was approved, who signed off on his bond, and why no one revisited those decisions after the 2017 charges were filed. The 2003 victim has said she feels like her warnings were ignored, that her calls and voicemails about his ongoing danger were treated as bureaucratic noise instead of urgent red flags. The 2017 victim has said that learning about the massacre left her shaken and guilt-ridden, even though she did everything she was supposed to do as a victim: report, cooperate, prepare to testify. There's a cruel twist in the fact that the trial meant to hold Jesse accountable on the 2017 charges was scheduled on the very day deputies were out on his land recovering bodies. One system date he couldn't manipulate, one court day he couldn't talk his way past, coincided almost exactly with the moment he chose to make sure he would never face a jury. In December 2024, a suspicious fire broke out at the Henryetta property, destroying what remained of the house. By then, it was already infamous as a place where the worst had happened, a physical reminder of both individual evil and institutional failure. Authorities opened an investigation into the fire, but for the families, nothing burned there could erase what had already been taken. When you strip this case down to its barest elements, what you're left with is chillingly simple. A young man commits a violent rape against a teenager at knife point. He's sentenced to 20 years. In prison, he gets hold of a phone, targets another 16-year-old for exploitation, and ends up facing fresh felonies. Despite that, he's released early, bonded out, and allowed to move into a home with children and host other people's kids overnight. Years later, on the morning he's finally supposed to be tried for what he did from inside that cell, he instead uses a gun to wipe out 6 people and himself. Every inflection point in that sequence was a moment when a system could have responded differently. It could have treated contraband child material in prison as an automatic early release stopper. It could have raised bond amounts or imposed stricter conditions for someone with Jesse's history. It could have tightened laws about where high-risk offenders can live and who they're allowed to have under their roofs. It could have built and maintained easily accessible tools for parents and partners to verify the background of the adults around their kids. None of that would change who Jesse was at his core. The responsibility for the killings rests on him. But laws and policies exist precisely because we know some people will choose to do harm, and because we've already learned from past tragedies what patterns to watch for. In Henryetta, those lessons weren't applied with the urgency they demanded. For the families living with the aftermath, justice now looks less like a courtroom verdict and more like a set of changes that might keep other parents from waking up to missing person alerts that end in crime scene tape. They talk about longer sentences for people who target kids, especially those who reoffend even while incarcerated. They push for better oversight of sex offender registries, more transparency, and clearer warnings to communities. They want to know why proactive warnings, from a cellmate disturbed by Jesse's constant sexual talk, from the 2003 victim calling about his contraband material, from the 2017 victim sending screenshots of his last messages, didn't trigger more urgent intervention. At vigils and in interviews, you can hear another thread running alongside the grief and anger, a tired compassion for each other. Parents hug parents who made similar decisions with similar information and somehow didn't lose their children. Neighbors who never thought to type his name into a registry website sit with the knowledge that, in a different set of circumstances, their own kids might have been on that property that night. When cases like this make the national news, they often fade after a few days. But in Henryetta, in Muskogee County courtrooms, in Oklahoma correctional offices, the questions don't go away. They live on in empty bedrooms, in trophies that will never be added to, in pageant sashes that will never be worn. If you are listening to a story like this from a distance, it's tempting to file it under something that could never touch your life. Another state, another system, another man whose face you'd never seen before the headlines. But the vulnerabilities this case exposed, the cracks in how early release is handled, how prison misconduct is treated, how communities are notified about high-risk offenders, are not unique to Oklahoma. They're questions every jurisdiction has to answer. Who gets second chances? And what do we do when those second chances reveal the same old patterns of harm? How much risk are we willing to place on kids' shoulders in the name of saving money on incarceration or giving offenders space to rebuild their lives? And when someone like Jesse shows, again and again, in prison and out, that he sees young people not as human beings but as things to be controlled and used, how do we ensure our systems respond as if that reality is more than just words in a file? In Henrietta, those questions are not abstract. They're carved into headstones, etched into a community that will never again see a teenage sleepover as something uncomplicated and safe. For Holly, for Rylee, for Michael, for Tiffany, for Ivy, and for Brittany, the only justice left is whatever changes are made in their names. They should still be here, arguing over outfits, complaining about homework, making playlists for road trips, taking selfies in bedroom mirrors. Instead, their story is a warning, and it's one we can't afford to ignore. In the weeks after the massacre, journalists and investigators started piecing together a more detailed timeline of Jesse's movements in the days leading up to May 1, 2023, and what emerged was a portrait of someone who knew exactly what was coming and was methodically preparing for it. Those Facebook messages he sent to the 2017 victim weren't impulsive outbursts written in a moment of panic. They were calculated, written from an account that used Holly's name but displayed his face, a choice that seemed designed to make sure the victim knew exactly who was contacting her and exactly what he meant when he said he wouldn't go back to prison. "I have a great life," he wrote, describing his job, his home, the structure he'd built in the 2.5 years since his release. "Now it's all gone." That phrasing is important because it shows how Jesse saw himself in relation to consequences. He didn't write, "I made mistakes and now I have to face them." He wrote, "It's all gone," as if his life had been taken from him by external forces rather than by his own choices. And then he told the victim it was her fault for continuing to cooperate with prosecutors, for refusing to recant, for insisting that what he'd done to her when she was 16 mattered. "This is all on you." Those words carry the full weight of an abuser's logic. "You made me do this by holding me accountable." It's the same logic that underlies domestic violence, stalking, and retaliatory murder. If you hadn't left me, if you hadn't testified, if you hadn't reported me, none of this would have happened. The responsibility is displaced, the violence reframed as something forced on the perpetrator by the victim's refusal to stay silent. The victim later said that, when she read those messages, her first thought wasn't that he was planning a massacre. She thought he might hurt himself, or that he was angry about losing his job, or that he was trying to intimidate her one last time before the trial. It wasn't until she heard about the bodies being discovered that she understood what he'd actually meant. She's lived with that knowledge ever since, that she was the last person outside that property to hear from him, and that his final communication before the killings was to blame her for what he was about to do. The question of why Jesse killed Holly and her children, in addition to Ivy and Brittany, is one that investigators and family members have tried to answer, even though Jesse left no manifesto, no detailed note, no explanation. The working theory, based on the evidence and the timeline, is that he saw the trial as a point of no return. If he went to court and was convicted, he was looking at years, possibly decades, in prison, this time with the added stigma of having reoffended while already incarcerated. His life outside, the great life he described to the victim, would be over. But why not just kill himself and leave everyone else alive? The autopsies showed that Ivy and Brittany sustained injuries consistent with sexual assault before they were killed. That suggests that at least part of Jesse's motive was to act out the same predatory violence he'd been charged with in other contexts, one last time, knowing he'd never face consequences because he planned to be dead before anyone could stop him. As for Holly and her children, their deaths may have been about control, about erasing the life he'd built and ensuring that no one he considered his would go on without him. Abusers who kill their partners and children often frame it in their own minds as a kind of twisted mercy. If I can't have this life, then no one will. If I'm going to die, they're coming with me. It's also possible that Holly or one of her children discovered what he was doing to Ivy and Brittany, and he killed them to eliminate witnesses. We'll never know for certain, because Jesse made sure of that. But what we do know is that 6 people who went asleep thinking they were safe woke up, if they woke up at all, in the final moments of their lives at the hands of someone who had been given chance after chance to prove he wasn't a threat, and who failed every single time. One of the most haunting details to emerge from family interviews is how normal everything seemed in the hours before the killings. Ivy's parents dropped her off, saw that there were other kids there, exchanged the usual reminders about checking in and being safe, and drove home. Brittany was excited, talking about the pageant, about her friends, about plans that felt immediate and real. Tiffany was hosting, doing what teenagers do when they have friends over, showing off the property, maybe staying up late, making memories that were supposed to last a lifetime. Holly was there in her role as mom, the person responsible for making sure everyone had what they needed and that the night went smoothly. Rylee and Michael were part of the household, the older siblings present in that weekend family rhythm. From the outside, it looked like a dozen other sleepovers happening that same night across Oklahoma, across the country. But inside that house was a man who had already decided that the next morning he would not be walking into a courtroom. And the gap between those two realities, the normal teenage sleepover and the planned massacre, is where the system failed. Because Jesse's dangerousness wasn't hidden. It was documented in court records, prison reports, victim statements, and the very charges he was supposed to answer for on May 1. The information existed. What didn't exist was a system capable of acting on that information in time. In the years since May 1, 2023, the families have found themselves navigating not just grief, but a kind of secondary trauma that comes from watching the legal and political systems move slowly, if at all, in response to what happened. Jeanette has spoken at community forums, calling for changes to early release laws and for better oversight of registered offenders. She's described the feeling of being handed a box of her daughter's and grandchildren's belongings, and knowing that this is all she'll ever have of them now. Photos, clothes, small objects that used to be part of everyday life and are now relics. Nathan Brewer has said that he thinks about Brittany every single day, that he still expects to hear her voice or see her walk through the door, and that the hardest part is realizing that every milestone she was looking forward to, graduation, college, marriage, kids of her own, has been erased. Ivy's family has focused on advocacy, pushing for legislative reforms that would close the loopholes Jesse slipped through. They've worked with victims' rights organizations to draft proposals for mandatory GPS monitoring of high-risk offenders, stricter bond conditions, and automatic reviews when someone serving time for a sex offense picks up new charges involving minors. None of that brings their daughter back, but it gives them something to do with the rage and sorrow, some way to feel like her death wasn't entirely meaningless. One of the most difficult conversations to have about cases like Henryetta is the one about prediction and prevention. We know, looking back, that Jesse was dangerous. We know he had a history of violence, that he reoffended even in prison, that he sent threatening messages the night before his trial, and that multiple people tried to warn the system about him. But in real time, the people making decisions about his release, his bond, and his trial schedule were working within legal frameworks that prioritize individual rights, due process, and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Those principles are important. They protect all of us from arbitrary state power and ensure that people aren't locked up based on hunches or bias. But they also create gaps that people like Jesse can exploit. The question isn't whether we should abandon due process. The question is whether we've built our systems in a way that accounts for the realities of predatory behavior, the escalation, the manipulation, the pattern matching that experienced investigators, victims, and even cellmates can recognize, but that doesn't always fit neatly into legal categories. Jesse's cellmate saw him as a threat and said so publicly after the fact. The 2003 victim called and tried to warn officials. The 2017 victim cooperated with prosecutors and provided evidence. All of that information was available, but it wasn't synthesized into a coordinated response. That's not a problem unique to Oklahoma. It's a problem that shows up over and over in cases where domestic violence escalates to murder, where stalking turns deadly, where sex offenders reoffend despite being in the system. The data is there. The warnings are there. What's missing is the infrastructure to connect the dots and the legal authority to act on those connections before someone else dies. As this is being written in early 2026, nearly 3 years after the Henryetta killings, some changes have been made in Oklahoma, though advocates say they don't go far enough. There's been increased funding for GPS monitoring of certain high-risk offenders, though the program is limited in scope and doesn't cover everyone it probably should. There's been discussion of closing the early release loophole that allowed Jesse to walk out of prison despite pending charges involving a minor, though as of now, no law has been passed that would definitively prevent a similar situation. There's been some movement toward making the sex offender registry more accessible and user-friendly, with proposals for mobile apps and community notification systems, though implementation has been slow and inconsistent. And there have been training programs for judges and prosecutors on recognizing patterns of escalation in sex offense cases, aimed at helping decision-makers see the full picture rather than just the narrow legal question in front of them at any given moment. Those are all steps in the right direction, but they're also incremental, and for the families in Henryetta, incremental change feels inadequate when measured against the totality of what was lost. If you've listened to this entire story, you might be feeling a lot of things right now: anger, sadness, frustration, maybe even a kind of exhausted helplessness at the scale of the failures involved. That's a reasonable response. But it's also worth sitting with the fact that this case, as horrific as it is not an outlier in the sense of being completely unpreventable or unprecedented. Variations of this story play out regularly. Someone with a documented history of violence is released, bonded out, or inadequately monitored, and they go on to commit more violence. Sometimes the victims are strangers. Often they're people in the perpetrator's immediate orbit, partners, children, people who trusted them or had no choice but to be near them. And every time the same questions come up. How did this happen? Why wasn't he still in prison? Who made the decision to let him out? The answers are usually some version of what we've seen in Henryetta: a combination of under-resourced agencies, legal technicalities, bureaucratic siloing, and a systemic bias toward managing risk on paper rather than in reality. If we want different outcomes, we have to demand different priorities. That means funding for the unglamorous work of monitoring, tracking, and enforcement. It means legal reforms that close the gaps people like Jesse slip through. It means listening to victims when they say someone is still dangerous, rather than treating their warnings as inconvenient or emotionally driven noise. It means accepting that some people who show over and over that they will harm others given the chance, should not be given that chance, even if it feels uncomfortable to say so in a society that values redemption and second chances. Jesse McFadden had his second chance. He used it to target another teenager, and when he finally faced the possibility of real consequences, he chose mass murder over accountability. Holly, Rylee, Michael, Tiffany, Ivy, and Brittany didn't get a second chance. They got one life, and it was stolen from them by someone who had already proven multiple times that he couldn't be trusted around kids. That's the legacy of Henryetta. Not just the grief, but the knowledge that this was preventable and the responsibility that comes with that knowledge. In Henryetta today, life has moved forward the way life always does, even in places marked by tragedy. Kids go to school. Parents go to work. The town still holds its events and festivals, still gathers for high school football games and church services. But there are absences that can't be filled. There's a generation of teenagers in that town who will always remember the spring when their classmates didn't come back from a sleepover. There are parents who will always check the sex offender registry before letting their kids go to a friend's house, because they know now that the unthinkable can happen even in a place that feels safe. There are teachers and coaches and neighbors who will carry the weight of those 6 losses, the what-ifs and if-onlys, for the rest of their lives. Jeanette has said that she still talks to Holly, Rylee, Michael, and Tiffany, that she tells them about her day and asks them questions even though she knows they can't answer. She said that the hardest part isn't the big moments, the birthdays and holidays, but the small ones, the random Tuesday afternoons when she'd normally text Holly a meme or call to check in, and the silence that greets her instead. Nathan has said that he sees Brittany and other kids her age, that he watches them graduate and go to college and wonders what his daughter would have chosen, what kind of person she would have become. Ivy's family has said that they think about all the firsts she'll never experience, and all the ways their own lives have been rearranged around her absence. That's the real cost of Henryetta, the cost that doesn't show up in headlines or policy debates. The decades of life that were stolen, the futures that were erased, the love and potential and simple, everyday presence that 6 people should still be bringing into the world and aren't. So when we talk about justice in a case like this, we're not really talking about punishment, because the person responsible is dead. We're talking about whether the systems that failed these 6 people will be fixed in time to save the next 6, or the 6 after that. We're talking about whether lawmakers will fund the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms that keep high-risk offenders from disappearing into the community unsupervised. We're talking about whether courts will treat new charges against already convicted offenders as the red flags they are, rather than as separate legal matters to be dealt with eventually. We're talking about whether victims who come forward will be heard and believed and protected, or whether they'll be told that the system is handling it, and then watch, helpless, as the person who hurt them goes free and hurts someone else. Those are the conversations Henryetta should force us to have. Not just in Oklahoma, but everywhere that similar gaps exist, which is pretty much everywhere. Because the specifics of this case, a rural property, a sleepover, a trial that never happened, are unique to Jesse McFadden and the people he killed. But the underlying failures are depressingly common. And until we treat those failures as urgent, as worth the money and political capital it takes to fix them, we're going to keep seeing headlines like the ones that came out of Henryetta in May 2023. Different names, different towns, same preventable tragedy. There's a detail that keeps coming up when you read through accounts from people who knew Jesse McFadden, either in prison or in the years after his release, and it's this. He was always testing boundaries, always looking for gaps in supervision, always trying to figure out who would say no and who could be pushed. James Fleming, the cellmate who lived with him at Joseph Harp Correctional Center, didn't just describe Jesse as sexually fixated in a vague, uncomfortable way. He said Jesse was relentless about it, turning every conversation back to explicit topics, making remarks that felt designed to see how much discomfort Fleming would tolerate before pushing back. Fleming said he stayed on guard even while sleeping, because he didn't trust what Jesse might do if he thought he could get away with it. That pattern, probe, test, escalate, was there in the 2003 Grape case, where Jesse didn't just assault the victim but tied her down and held a knife to her throat, making sure she understood that he had total control and that resistance would be met with violence. It was there in the way he groomed the 2017 victim from inside a prison cell, using a phone he wasn't supposed to have to build a relationship with a 16-year-old girl he'd never met in person, convincing her to send images, and then using those images as leverage to keep her compliant. It was there in the fake impersonation scheme, where he allegedly paid someone to pretend to be the 2003 victim and lie to Holly about the circumstances of his original conviction, rewriting his history just enough to neutralize her doubts. And it was there, most catastrophically, in the hours before his trial, when he sent the 2017 victim those messages blaming her for his choices and making it clear that he would not allow himself to be held accountable. "I told you I wouldn't go back. This is all on you. Those words weren't just threats or expressions of anger. They were declarations of intent from someone who had spent his entire adult life refusing to accept that other people, especially girls and women, had the right to say no to him, to report him, to expect consequences for what he'd done. When Fleming spoke publicly after the massacre, he said something that stuck with a lot of people. He believed Jesse's obsession was so deep that if he hadn't been strong enough to fend him off, Jesse might have tried something even inside that cell. Fleming's comments weren't meant to center himself in the story. They were meant to underline that this wasn't a man who'd made a mistake 20 years ago and learned from it. This was someone whose core identity was wrapped up in domination, in sexualizing vulnerability, and in punishing anyone who tried to hold him to account. In the aftermath of the Henryetta killings, prosecutors and victim advocates in Oklahoma started asking hard questions about how the Department of Corrections had handled Jesse's case. Here's what made people angriest. The contraband phone wasn't just a rules violation. It was evidence that Jesse, even inside a locked facility, was actively seeking out minors for exploitation. That should have been treated as proof that he was exactly as dangerous as his original conviction suggested, maybe more so, because now he'd shown he could adapt his predation to new technology and new circumstances. Instead, the system treated the phone incident and the resulting charges as a separate legal matter that would be dealt with eventually, while his original sentence kept ticking down. By the time he walked out in October 2020, he'd served enough time on the 2003 case to qualify for release under Oklahoma's standard calculations, and the 2017 charges were still stuck in pretrial limbo. Defense attorney Lee Berlin, who as mentioned earlier specializes in sex crime cases, said he was baffled by how that could happen within existing law. He pointed out that most jurisdictions have mechanisms to hold someone pending trial if new charges demonstrate ongoing danger, especially when the new charges involve kids and the person's entire criminal history is about targeting kids. The bond amount, $25,000, struck many observers as shockingly low for someone in Jesse's position. To post that bond, he or someone helping him would have needed to come up with a fraction of that total, often 10%, meaning he could be back on the street for as little as $2,500 in practical terms. Compare that to other cases where people with far less violent histories and no charges involving children are held on higher bonds or no bond at all, and the disparity becomes hard to explain. Victims' families have asked whether race, connections, or simple bureaucratic inertia played a role. They've asked why no one in the system looked at Jesse's file as a whole: original conviction, prison conduct, new charges, victim warnings, and flagged it for special review. They've asked why the 2003 victim's calls about his contraband material didn't result in an immediate reevaluation of his release eligibility. They've asked why the judge overseeing the 2017 case didn't impose stricter conditions, like GPS monitoring or restrictions on who he could live with. So far, the answers have been vague or absent. Officials have said the case is being reviewed, but no one has publicly taken responsibility for the specific decisions that left Jesse free to kill. Holly's mother, Jeanette Mayo, has become one of the most visible voices calling for change. In interviews, she talks about Holly not just as a victim but as a person, someone who loved crafts, who drove hours to see her kids' school events, who wanted to believe that people could change, and that her relationship with Jesse was a second chance for both of them. Jeanette has said she wishes she'd known sooner just how violent Jesse's original crime had been, and that she wishes the system had tools in place to alert families when someone with that history moves into a home with children. She's pointed out that sex offender registries exist, but aren't always user-friendly or prominent enough for people to check them as part of everyday decisions about sleepovers, carpools, or family gatherings. She's also talked about the guilt she feels, even though logically she knows she's not to blame. "I keep thinking, what could I have done differently?" she said in one interview, her voice breaking. But the truth is, the system had all the information. They knew what he was. They let him out anyway. Nathan Brewer, Brittany's father, has echoed that sentiment. At a vigil held days after the bodies were found, he stood in front of hundreds of people and said his daughter had been excited about life, about the pageant, about her future. She was just starting to figure out who she wanted to be, he said. And now we'll never know. Ivy's family has been more private in their grief, but they've supported efforts to push for legislative changes and better enforcement of existing laws. They've made it clear that they don't want their daughter's name to just be a headline. They want it attached to reforms that actually prevent this from happening again. In the months after May 1, 2023, Oklahoma lawmakers faced pressure to address the gaps that the Henryetta case had exposed. Some proposed tightening early release rules for violent offenders, particularly those whose crimes involved sexual violence against minors. The argument was straightforward. If someone shows a pattern of targeting kids and then demonstrates that pattern again even while incarcerated, the default should be to keep them locked up, not to release them and hope they don't reoffend. Others pushed for mandatory GPS monitoring and stricter residency rules, pointing out that in Jesse's case, no one was tracking his movements or checking whether he was in compliance with registry requirements. He was supposed to report address changes and stay away from places like schools and parks, but the enforcement mechanism was largely passive. He'd only get in trouble if someone caught him breaking the rules, not because anyone was actively watching. There were also calls for better communication between the Department of Corrections, prosecutors, and judges handling new charges against people already serving time. If Jesse's 2017 case had been treated as a red flag for the officials considering his early release, the timeline might have looked very different. As it stood, it seemed like two parts of the system, corrections and the courts, were operating on separate tracks, neither fully aware of or responsive to what the other was doing. But legislation takes time, and political will can be fleeting. As of early 2026, some reforms have been discussed, but comprehensive changes to Oklahoma's sex offender laws and early release policies remain a work in progress. For the families, that's another kind of wound, watching the news cycle move on, watching other tragedies take over the front pages, and wondering whether their loved ones' deaths will actually lead to the systemic change they were promised. One of the cruelest ironies of the case is that multiple people tried to sound the alarm, and all of them were ignored or sidelined. The victim in the 2003 case called and left messages trying to warn officials that Jesse still had contraband child material and that his behavior in prison showed he hadn't changed. She was transferred between departments, given vague reassurances, and ultimately left with the sense that no one wanted to hear from her because acknowledging her warnings would mean admitting the system had failed. The victim in the 2017 case cooperated fully with prosecutors, provided evidence, and was ready to testify. She even sent screenshots of Jesse's threatening messages to the district attorney's office the night before the trial. But by then, it was too late. Jesse had already decided he wasn't going to face a jury, and the machinery of violence had already been set in motion. Fleming, the cellmate, talked openly about how disturbing Jesse's behavior was and said he believed Jesse would have hurt him if he'd thought he could get away with it. That kind of insight from someone who lived in close quarters with Jesse for an extended period should have been part of any risk assessment before his release. There's no indication it was. And Holly's family has said that if they'd been given clear, accessible information about Jesse's past, not just a registry entry that required them to know to look for it, but active notification that a violent grape offender was living in their daughter's home, they would have intervened. All of these warnings were out there, in voicemails, in court filings, in prison records, in the minds of people who saw Jesse up close and understood what he was capable of. But the system is set up in such a way that individual warnings often don't trigger coordinated action. Instead, they sit in separate files, separated by bureaucratic walls, until something terrible happens and investigators go back and find that all the pieces were there, just never assembled in time. Henryetta is a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows someone who knows someone else. That means the grief didn't stay contained to 6 families. It rippled out through schools, churches, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Teachers who'd had Rylee, Michael, Tiffany, Ivy, or Brittany in their classrooms talked about empty desks and assignments that would never be turned in. Classmates made memorial posters and held candlelight vigils, standing in parking lots with their parents and trying to make sense of why this had happened. The pageant community rallied around Brittany's memory, honoring her with the title and sash she'd worked for, making sure that even though she couldn't attend the event in Tulsa, she was recognized and remembered. Local businesses put up signs and ribbons. Strangers from across the state sent flowers, donations, and letters to the families. For weeks, Henryetta was defined by this single tragedy, by the knowledge that something monstrous had happened in their midst, and that the person responsible had been living openly among them. There was also anger at the system, at the laws, at the officials who'd made the decisions that put Jessie back on the street. Some of that anger was directed at people who'd interacted with Jessie and hadn't reported suspicions, though in truth, there's no clear evidence that neighbors or acquaintances had specific knowledge of planned violence. What they had were uneasy feelings, the sense that something about him didn't add up, the kind of low-level discomfort that people often dismiss because it feels unkind to act on a hunch. That's part of what makes cases like this so insidious. Predators like Jessie are often skilled at blending in just enough, presenting a version of themselves that doesn't scream danger to casual observers, while behind closed doors they're testing boundaries, grooming victims, and planning their next move. By December 2024, the house where the killings were planned had become a grim landmark, the kind of place people slow down to look at when they drive past, even though there's nothing to see but emptiness and ghosts. And then it burned. Authorities called the fire suspicious and opened an investigation, though details have not been widely released. For some in the community, the fire felt like a final erasure, the physical structure that had contained so much horror going up in smoke. For others, it was a relief, one less reminder of what had been done there, one less place for curiosity seekers to gawk at. But the house was never really the point. The horror of Henryetta isn't contained in walls or land. It's in the choices that were made by people in positions of power, and in the lives that were stolen because those choices prioritized bureaucracy over safety. If you're looking for a tidy moral to this story, you won't find one, because the truth is messier and more frustrating than any lesson you could boil it down to. What happened in Henryetta wasn't the result of one bad decision. It was the result of dozens of small failures that compounded over years. It was the decision to treat Jessie's contraband phone and exploitation of the 2017 victim as a separate legal matter, instead of as evidence that he remained a threat. It was the decision to release him after 17 years even though his behavior in prison showed he hadn't been rehabilitated. It was the decision to set bond at $25,000 instead of holding him without bond or imposing strict conditions. It was the decision not to prioritize the trial, allowing delays to stretch from 2017 to 2023. It was the decision not to build systems that actively notify communities when high-risk offenders move into homes with children. It was the decision, over and over, to give Jessie the benefit of the doubt, even though he had never earned it and had repeatedly shown that he would use any freedom he was given to harm others. Those decisions weren't made by one person, and they weren't made with malicious intent. They were made by people working within systems that are under-resourced, overburdened, and often more focused on managing caseloads than on deeply assessing risk. But the impact of those decisions is the same as if they'd been made maliciously. 6 people are dead, families are shattered, and a community is left asking how something so preventable was allowed to happen. This is where the story ends, at least in terms of the chronological events. Jesse McFadden is dead by his own hand, taking with him any chance for a trial, for testimony, for the kind of public accountability that victims and their families deserved. Holly, Rylee, Michael, Tiffany, Ivy, and Brittany are gone, their futures erased in a few minutes of methodical violence on a spring weekend in Oklahoma. The investigations have concluded that Jesse acted alone, that there was no conspiracy, no accomplice, no hidden twist that changes the fundamental facts. What remains are the questions, and they're the kind that don't have expiration dates. How many other people like Jesse are moving through the system right now, picking up new charges while serving old sentences, getting released anyway because no one connects the dots in time? How many families are making decisions about sleepovers and carpools and relationships without access to the information that could protect them? Because the tools we've built to track offenders are clunky, incomplete, or hidden behind bureaucratic barriers. How many victims are calling, texting, emailing, trying to warn someone that the person who hurt them is about to hurt someone else, only to be met with silence or vague reassurances that the system is handling it? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the operational realities of a system that, in too many places, treats public safety as something that happens after all the other priorities: budget concerns, legal technicalities, political considerations, have been addressed. The families of the Henryetta victims are trying to make sure that this case isn't forgotten, that it becomes a reference point whenever lawmakers debate early release policies, bond amounts, registry enforcement, and victim notification. They're trying to turn their grief into something that might save someone else's child, even though nothing will bring back theirs. That's the work that happens after the cameras leave and the headlines fade. The slow, exhausting push to change laws, to fund programs, to train officials, to build the infrastructure that makes tragedies like this less likely. If there's anything to hold on to from this story, it's the reminder that the people we lose to violence are not just names in a news report. They're the 17-year-old who was figuring out what kind of adult she wanted to be. They're the 15-year-old boy who had inside jokes with his friends and dreams that felt urgent and real. They're the 13-year-old who loved hosting sleepovers and making people feel welcome in her home. They're the 14-year-old who loved animals and had parents who thought they were doing everything right by letting her spend time with trusted friends. They're the 15-year-old pageant contestant who wanted to teach or heal animals, or maybe both, because why should you have to pick just one future when you're that young? They're the 35-year-old mom who drove 2 hours to see her daughter sing in a choir concert, and who believed that the man she'd married had left his past behind. Every single one of them should still be here. Every single one of them was failed by a system that had the information, the authority, and the responsibility to keep them safe. The only justice they can have now is the kind that comes from making sure fewer families have to join theirs in mourning. That work is ongoing, and it's work that all of us, voters, advocates, neighbors, parents, have a role in pushing forward, because Henryetta was preventable. And the next Henryetta is preventable too if we choose to act like we've learned something from this one. The last thing worth saying about this case is something that Jeanette said in one of her interviews, and it stayed with a lot of people who have followed this story. She was asked what she wanted people to take away from what happened to her family, and she didn't talk about vengeance or punishment or even justice in the traditional sense. She said, "Remember their names: Holly Guess, Rylee Elizabeth Allen, Michael James Mayo, Tiffany Guess, Ivy Webster, Brittany Brewer, not as victims, not as statistics, not as bullet points in a discussion about criminal justice reform, but as people who mattered, who were loved, who should still be here. People who went to sleep on an ordinary spring night in Oklahoma and never woke up, because the systems designed to protect them valued procedure over safety, because warnings were ignored, because a man who should never have been free was given chance after chance after chance." That's the story of Henryetta. And it's a story that should matter to all of us, because it could have been prevented, and because the next one can be too, if we choose to act like we've learned something.